Let's pick up where we left off in the last video, where we're going to subdivide the parts of our model that we want to apply some detail work to. I'm going to subdivide this model just a bit. I think we already did it in the previous video, but I wanted to show, even though we've prepped our model for subdivision, there are still a few things we need to consider before we proceed. Low polygon models tend to have varying levels of density for optimization reasons. That's great for game and animation models, but not so much for sculpting. When you subdivide, you're still going to have less subdivision in this area than you would where you have created geometry along the edges. That being the case, you might sometimes notice a little bit of lumpiness or unevenness as you begin to subdivide your model for that very reason. I've noticed other artists complain about it sometimes when they're sculpting. The solution is to evenly distribute the polygons, and we can do that in 3D Coach by hitting the Enter key. That will temporarily voxelize and remesh the model to where it's nice and uniform, and then return it right back to surface mode in the same step. We can also just switch to voxel mode. I'm going to go ahead and do that with this model. I'll click the S icon. I do want to subdivide one time before I commit it to voxels. That way I don't have any of the faceting that we talked about in the previous video. And then I'm going to give it 1 million polygons. Okay. You'll notice how everything is relatively uniform. I'll go ahead and hide that. Hide the other objects that I'm not going to work on for now. I am going to do the same thing with this one. I'll leave it at 500 for now. And let's go ahead and subdivide it one time before we voxelize it. Okay. Now let's go to the visor copy. To voxels we go, but I will probably switch to surface mode at some point. So let's go 2 million. We're going to go a little bit high. Hit OK. And yeah, let's subdivide one time before we commit to voxels. Okay. Now I'm also going to give myself a little bit more thickness on this by right-clicking and choosing to extrude. Let's make that 0.7. Okay. Now, I want to put some type of a decorative medallion here at the center of this visor. What I think I will do is, instead of using voxel extrude, I'm going to use the surface brushes, because that will allow me to dial the depth back after the fact. Voxel brushes, you don't have that capacity. You have to use surface tools, or you have to be in surface mode in order to utilize sculpt layers. Let's go to the extrude brush in surface mode, and I'm going to choose a brush alpha like this. It has just a slight bit of fall off around the edge, but not a lot. Let's go with a stamp draw mode. I'm going to check my depth limit here. Let's increase that to about 20 or so. I'm going to go to an orthographic view by clicking this cube icon. I can also hit the 5 key on the number pad. You can toggle back into perspective or orthographic. And then you can choose your view here or use your number keys. I'll hit the S key to turn symmetry on as well. X-axis, enable that. I can start at the center here. Okay, then rotate and look and see how far out that extruded. Because I use surface extrude, I can adjust the depth value. Okay, it looks good. Now I'm going to stay in extrude, but I'm going to invert it this time. And I'll use a harder edge brush alpha like that. Go back to a front view. When you're working in an orthographic view and you're trying to avoid perspective distortion, I would recommend using object bounding box as your rotation center, because by default around current pick point is chosen. That's great when you're sculpting because it allows you to rotate around the area that you're actually working on. But when modeling in an orthographic view, you want to make sure you're using object bounding box, or you could choose world center. That way it stays centered when you choose different views. Otherwise, if you use the around current pick point, if your cursor's over here, your model is going to bounce around from view to view. And again, that's not what you want. Now, to make sure that I'm at the very center, I can go to the view menu and I can turn my 2D grid on, 2D snapping as well. I can just click here. In order to keep this video as brief as possible, I'm going to speed up the playback from this point forward and try to provide commentary as I go. I'm going to go back to the same brush alpha I started with and create one additional outward extrusion. I'm noticing here that I forgot to check and make sure ignore back faces was not unchecked, because it's going to apply all the way through. Since I was using the surface tools, I could quickly switch to surface mode and use the erase brush in order to erase that backside sculpt layer information. But I made sure ignore back facing in the E panel was now checked. Now using the fill brush in order to fill in any holes. I'm going to hold down the Shift key and use the Relax Smoothing mode. I could smooth it further, but I'll leave it alone for now because it's not going to be seen by the camera anyway. I've just selected an ornamental brush alpha that I'm going to use to apply here in the center. I also switched to Live Clay as my brush to dynamically tessellate, and I'm turning my 2D grid back on. And that looks a little bit shallow, so I'm going to increase the depth level a bit. I'll also turn the 2D grid off for now. And I switched my brush alpha to a different ornament. I could have turned radial symmetry on, but for now I think this will work just fine. I'll try a different flourish here for the side. Switch to a different brush alpha. Again, I'm using Live Clay so that it tessellates as it creates the ornament. The next thing I want to do here is to create some type of beveling along the edges. I could have done that originally in the Voxel Workspace by extruding edges, but I want to show how you could do it in the Sculpt Workspace as well. Before I do that, I want to apply a pinch around the outer edge of this circle because it's a little bit too soft right now. Using the pinch tool plus the closed spline, I selected the circle, then I right-clicked on the shape itself, and in the right-click menu, I chose Brush Along Stroke. And you will see that repeated later on. Right now, what I'm doing is using the Erase tool to erase the sculpt layer information where the pinch tool was a little bit too aggressive along the edge there. Now what I'm doing is from the Shift key or the Control Shift key menus, you have different smoothing options, and I chose Tangent Smooth because it's really good for removing rough tangency without degrading much of the detail at all. Now I'm going through and using the pinch tool by hand just to touch it up a little bit. There's a lot more that I could do if this were a production model, but for demonstration purposes, I think this will do just fine. I'm going to create another shape here. I'm going to right click and have it attached to surface from the menu, and then I will go ahead and right click on that shape and choose Brush Along Surface. Alright, this would be a good point to stop the video here, and we're going to pick up in the next one where we're going to begin creating that bevel along the edge and work on some of the other objects as well. So stay tuned and we'll see you then.